Let's now talk so much royal news with the great Michael Cole, former BBC royal correspondent, but he's so much more than that. And he joins us now from merry old England. Great man, lovely to see you. Prince Andrew, yet another week rolls by and we now know even more about his interactions with the disgraceful Jeffrey Epstein. This one takes the cake, doesn't it?
Well, it is an extraordinary state of affairs because in that notorious 2019, I remember it very well, interview that Emily Maitlis of BBC's Newsnight conducted with His Royal Highness the Duke of York, he made it plain that he'd gone to New York and stayed for 5 days in Jeffrey Epstein's fabulous villa. And he said that he went there merely to do the gentlemanly thing, the right, the decent thing, to tell Jeffrey Epstein to his face that he could no longer be his friend because of his conviction for paedophile offences and the strange sentence that he'd served in Florida, where he didn't seem to spend much time in jail at all. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to go and spend 5 days to tell somebody something quite simply that could have been said on the phone or even by a letter. And now it's emerged that Prince Andrew was having other discussions with this said late Epstein, and those were business affairs. There's been talk of oil contracts. So quite clearly, it wasn't the severance that there should have been a lot earlier, even in 2010. So I think somebody's being disingenuous here. And it's another, I think, black mark against the late Queen's second son.
Do you think that we're starting to hear about this because Andrew has been making a lot of noise, that he doesn't like the arrangements that the King is putting him under? Or are we hearing about this from the American end of things?
Well, it's very interesting, and that's a very perceptive question, because quite clearly there's not a great deal of love lost between the King and his younger brother. The King was never a great admirer of Andrew, even in the palmy days when they were closer to each other than they are now. There are problems over the residency that the Prince has of Windsor Lodge, a beautiful white wedding cake of a mansion set amid trees in Windsor Great Park. At one stage, the King wanted him to move out to go to the lesser Frogmore Cottage, where the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, Harry and Meghan, were supposed to live before they decamped to Canada and then to California. But Prince Andrew is saying he's got a 75-year lease on Windsor Lodge, and he's been spending money on repairing it, upkeep and so on, and he refuses to move. It's a difficult situation. It would obviously be much more appropriate for Windsor Lodge, which is where the Queen Mother lived for many years quite happily and had lived there with her husband when he was alive before he became king. It would have been more appropriate for Prince William and Catherine, the Prince and Princess of Wales, and their 3 children to have moved in there, more in keeping with their status, and quite frankly, much easier to be protected from a security point of view, because you can see Windsor Lodge, Royal Lodge Windsor, from the road, but you can't get anywhere near it. And it would be a perfect place for the heir, the direct heir, the heir apparent, and his wife and 3 children to live. But so there are these problems, and I think there are 1 or 2 people also lurking in the woodwork, in the undergrowth, who have been leaking these stories because they don't want Prince Andrew to be making any comeback soon to royal life. And he's been making noises that he would want to come back. I think that shows, Paul, his sense of delusion about the depth of trouble he's in.
Speaking of delusion, Harry and Meghan, what about trying to hit up the President of the United States to hitchhike your way back to the United States? And unsurprisingly, POTUS, who I'm pretty sure always flies with a full plane, didn't have any room for Harry on the way back from the Queen's funeral.
Paul Murray, in this world, there is sheer audacity, there's cheek, there's chutzpah, And then there's the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, Harry and Meghan. So after the Queen's funeral, they roll up and they ask the Bidens, by the way, could we have a hitch a ride with you back to the United States on Air Force One? Well, the White House had absolutely no difficulty in turning them down flat immediately. And I can't work out whether they're naive or simply crass, because this great sense of entitlement sits very ill with people on both sides of the Atlantic. Because I haven't been on Air Force One, but I have been on the press plane that follows behind wherever the president goes on Air Force One. And there are very strict protocols at work. For instance, the pool reporter who goes on board Air Force One to write a pooled story for everybody about what happens on the journey, who the president sees, who he talks to, and so on, he pays for his fare. He or she, the pool reporter, pays for his fare. When the president has members of his family who are not part of the official party, he pays their fare. If he has friends on board, he pays their fare on Air Force One. And if he uses Air Force One for campaigning or for a political reason, a party political reason, he then pays his way. So there are strict protocols. For them to think they can just hitch a ride, what were they going to do, Paul, when they got to Washington, to Andrews Air Force Base? Were they going to hope that one of their star-studded friends with a private yacht, a private jet, a G5 or something was there, so that they could make the next leg to California? And all the time, of course, parading their ecological, their green credentials, their concern for the environment, while at the same time hopping around the world on private planes.
Yeah, as you say, sort of, a whole new version of hubris. The idea that you'd be saying to the President of the United States, hey, mate, can you give me a lift? By the way, can you go to the other side of the country first and drop me off? Yeah, I know you've got stuff to do, but, we've got a documentary to make. Now, you mentioned a yacht.
Yeah, well, this is the most famous aircraft in the world. And, of course, the security conditions of the security arrangements are massive, and quite rightly so, because there are a load of mad people out there. We know that. I mean, to actually think that they could bum a ride, if I can put it like that, in that way with POTUS and Jill Biden, his wife, on the basis of knowing them. But of course, this does tie in with the widely reported and believed by people like me that Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, has political ambitions. And if she does, they're all on the blue side of the map. They're all on the Democratic Party side. And she probably sees herself with a political role in the future, whether as a congresswoman or a senator even. Who can say the limits of her ambition? Because I'm sure they're great.
Now, you mentioned with the Freudian slip before about a private yacht, and that's exactly what the royal family's about to get another one of. What's wrong with the current royal yacht?
Well, of course, that was Britannia, which, of course, sailed many times into the most beautiful harbour in the world, which is the one very close to where you're sitting now. And Britannia, of course, was commissioned. It was one of the last things that King George VI did. He signed the contract for the building of Britannia up at John Brown's shipyard near Glasgow on Clydeside. And that was built and delivered to the Queen in her coronation year, 1953, and she announced the name Britannia at its launching. Now, that was retired by the Tony Blair government. They wouldn't pay for a refit. And that Britannia now sits at the docks in Edinburgh at Leith, and it's a great tourist attraction and is used by people for certain events. But there hasn't been a royal yacht since that retirement of Britannia, although there have been royal yachts going back 300 or 400 years. So now the government is saying or considering building a new royal yacht. And of course, it has a purpose. I mean, the Queen's Britannia was like a sort of floating palace, but it was the center of a lot of soft diplomacy. A lot of good work was done upon it, and it went around the world millions of miles, or certainly a huge number of miles. And I remember very well, people like Bob Hawke, climbing up the gangplank and being saluted by the admiral with the telescope under his arm, and some great Commonwealth events on board Britannia. The famous picture that was always taken at Commonwealth heads of government conferences. So it has a purpose. And of course, the Queen loved it because it was always home from home. Wherever she was in the world, she could come home and feel as if she was actually almost at Sandringham or Balmoral, because it was equipped in the way that she liked it. So it seems there's going to be at some future stage a new royal yacht. But of course, that would depend upon the Conservative government winning power again in a general election next year. Maybe if Labour gets in, they'll have a different view.
Yeah, anyone keeping an eye on the polls would suggest they might have to wait a little longer for a royal yacht. But we'll wait and see. The good people of England have every chance to make up their own mind, and who knows what government they'll come up with. Thank you, great man. We'll talk to you very soon. Michael Cole in the UK. All the best.